Now we're going to talk about something called invisible buttons. If you're following along, I'm working in 04_invisible_buttons.fla, and that file is in the Chapter 10 folder in the Exercise Files folder. Before we look at anything on the stage, let's test the movie and talk about what invisible buttons are. Command Return on the Mac, Control Enter on the PC. Notice you don't see any buttons in this movie, but when you roll over the robot's mouth, something happens. There's a line pointing to the robot's mouth and text that says mouth. The same thing with the robot's logo. I didn't turn the robot's mouth or the robot's logo into buttons. Rather, I created something called invisible buttons. Invisible buttons are buttons that don't have an up state. But just because a button doesn't have an up state doesn't mean you can't create a button. Let's close this window and talk a little bit more about that. On the stage, there are 4 layers: background, robot, logo, and the buttons layer. The buttons layer contains 2 invisible buttons. Notice that the buttons are kind of a transparent cyan color. That's what invisible buttons look like in Flash. Let's take a look at what's inside of the symbols in the library to see how these buttons were created. Instead of going to symbol editing mode through the library, let's do it on the stage. Now I'm going to double click the button for the robot's mouth on the stage to enter its timeline. Notice that the stage is grayed out, and at the bottom of the timeline you can see that I'm working in BTN mouth. Let's take a look at how this timeline is set up. The up frame simply has a blank keyframe. The over frame has a line pointing to the robot's mouth and the mouth text. Same thing as on the down frame. Let's see what's on the hit frame. The hit frame is just a simple rectangle covering the robot's mouth. Let's return to the main timeline by clicking Scene 1 at the bottom of the timeline. Now let's take a look at how the robot's logo button is set up. Double-click the logo button on the main timeline to enter its timeline. You can tell that you're in the logo button's timeline when you see BTN logo at the bottom of the timeline. Again, there's nothing on the up state or the up frame. That's what makes this an invisible button. On the over frame, you can see the logo text and the line pointing to the logo. The same thing as on the down frame. The hit frame is a rectangle that covers the logo. So when you roll over the hit frame or when you roll over the hit area, even though there's no art on the up state, you see the art that's in the over state. And that's how invisible buttons work. Now let's create an invisible button that activates when you roll over the robot's eyes. Return to the main timeline by clicking Scene 1 at the bottom of the timeline. On the buttons layer, draw a rectangle over the robot's eyes. Select the rectangle tool in the toolbar. I'm going to choose No Stroke for the stroke color. To do that, I'm going to click Stroke Color at the bottom of the toolbar, then I'm going to click the No Color button. Notice now for the stroke color, there's a white box with a red line through it. When you're creating an invisible button, it doesn't matter what color you use for the fill or if you use a stroke or not. I just prefer not to use a stroke. That's because the art is more simple when you don't have a stroke. Now, draw a rectangle over the robot's eyes. This is going to represent the hit state of our button. Using the selection tool, select the rectangle you just drew on the stage and press F8 on your keyboard to convert it to a symbol. For the symbol's name, choose BTN, eyes with a capital E, choose button for the type, top left registration, and click OK. Notice that the symbol you just created on the stage looks different from the 2 other symbols. That's because the button you just created still has an up state. We'll modify that right now to change this button into an invisible button. Double-click the button you just created on the stage. You'll know that you're in the button's timeline because you'll see BTN eyes at the bottom of the timeline. What we want to do is take the graphic we just created and only use it for the hit state of the button. To do that, select the up frame by clicking once and releasing your mouse button. Then click the frame again and drag it to the hit frame and release your mouse button. You should have blank frames for up, over, and down, and the only graphic should be on the hit frame. Now let's define what happens in the over frame. Select the over frame and press F7 on your keyboard. That's the keyboard shortcut to create a blank keyframe. If you pressed F6 instead of F7, you would create a keyframe based on the last keyframe, or make a copy of the last keyframe. Because the last keyframe was a blank keyframe, in the up state, you would have created a blank keyframe as well. Now let's draw some lines from the robot's eyes out into the blank area on the stage. So let's select the line tool. I'm using a black stroke with a stroke height of 5. Then I'm going to draw lines from the robot's eyes out into the blank area. Next to the lines, I'm going to use the text tool, select static text, choose a font size, a font color, I chose Verdana, 18 pixels for the size, white for the color. Then I'm going to click, and I'm going to type eyes. I'm typing it in all caps because I used all caps for the mouth and the logo. Once you're done editing the text, press Escape to exit text editing mode. You can then move the text around using the directional arrows on your keyboard, or you can use the selection tool. I'm using the direction arrows on my keyboard. Let's return to the main timeline by clicking Scene 1 at the bottom of the timeline, and then test the movie using Command Return on the Mac or Control Enter on the PC. Roll over the robot's eyes to activate the invisible button, and you see the lines going towards the robot's eyes and the text that says eyes. And so there's a look at creating invisible buttons.